I thought I was just fixing a fence, but the moment she whispered, "Don't leave yet," I knew this was about more than wood and nails. The day it started, the air smelled like damp earth and fresh-cut grass, that soft, cool scent that only comes with early spring mornings. I just finished breakfast when I got the text from Clara, my neighbor's wife. She wrote simply, "Hey, sorry to bother you. The fence between our yards is leaning again. Could you take a look?" It was a reasonable request. I'd been helping them with odd jobs here and there ever since her husband's work started taking him out of town for weeks at a time. But something about the message felt different, almost careful, like she didn't want to sound like she was asking too much. I grabbed my toolbox and headed over. The sun hadn't burned off the morning chill yet, and there was a faint mist clinging to the grass. The fence ran the length of our backyards, old cedar boards weathered to a soft gray. Sure enough, a section near the middle was sagging, one post almost ready to give. When I knocked on their back door, Clara appeared, framed by the warm light of the kitchen behind her. She was wearing a loose cream-colored sweater, sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and her hair was tied back casually. She smiled, polite but with a trace of weariness, and stepped outside, folding her arms against the cool air. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, voice gentle but tired in a way that made me wonder how much she'd been handling on her own lately. I told her it was no trouble, then crouched to inspect the post. The wood was soft at the base, rot had started to eat away at it. As I worked, I could feel her eyes on me, not in a distracting way, but with the quiet focus of someone who doesn't get much company. She stayed nearby, leaning lightly against the porch railing, asking if I thought it would be a quick fix. I told her I could brace it up for now, but eventually, the post would have to be replaced. She nodded, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and for a second, I caught a glimpse of something unspoken in her face. Not worry exactly, but something deeper, like this fence wasn't the only thing in her life that felt unstable. I told myself not to read too much into it. I was just a neighbor, after all, doing a small favor. Still, there was something in the quiet way she stood there, watching, that made the yard feel different, like I'd stepped into a space that had been waiting, empty, for someone to notice it. I set to work bracing the fence, pulling out my hammer and a few spare boards I brought over. The job was simple enough, but there was something about the silence of their yard that made each strike of the hammer sound louder than usual. Somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barked, and the air carried the faint hum of distant lawnmowers. Clara disappeared into the house for a while, and for a moment I thought she'd gone back to her day. But a few minutes later, the door creaked open again, and she stepped out, carrying 2 tall glasses of lemonade on a tray. The sunlight caught the glass, sending little flashes of gold across the porch. "I thought you could use this," she said with a small smile, setting one glass down on the fence post beside me. The condensation slid down onto the wood, leaving a dark ring where it touched. "Perfect timing," I said, wiping the back of my hand across my forehead before picking up the drink. The glass was cold against my palm, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the day starting to creep in. She stayed near this time, leaning against the post as I worked. The conversation stayed light. How this fence had been here since they bought the house, how it always seemed to lean more after every winter storm. But between her words, there were little pauses, as if she was thinking about more than just weather and lumber. At one point, a stubborn board refused to stay straight while I nailed it in. Before I could ask, Clara crouched down beside me. "Here," she said softly, pressing her hands to the board to hold it in place. I was suddenly very aware of how close she was, her shoulder brushing against my arm, the faint scent of vanilla and soap rising from her sweater. Our hands met for a moment as I shifted my grip, her skin cool and soft against the rough calluses on my fingers. Neither of us said anything, but the pause that followed felt longer than it really was. She glanced at me, just briefly, and then looked away, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with her free hand. "Got it," I said finally, driving the last nail in. The board stayed in place, but my heartbeat felt unsteady, like I'd just finished running. Clara stood, brushing dust from her knees, and gave me a quiet, almost approving nod. "You make that look easy," she said, her voice light, but carrying something warmer underneath. As I worked through the last few boards, she stayed there with me, sometimes quiet, sometimes asking small questions about tools or wood or nothing important at all. But every time I glanced up and saw her watching, I felt that same pull, like there was something she wasn't saying, something sitting in the quiet between us. By the time I finished bracing the last section, the sun was hanging high enough to warm the back of my neck. I stood, brushing sawdust from my jeans, and told Clara the fence should hold for a while. She nodded, but didn't move toward the house right away. Instead, she lingered, almost hesitant, her fingers tracing the top of the fence post, as if she didn't quite want the moment to end. "You've been working all morning," she said finally. "Why don't you come in for a break? I made some coffee earlier." It was a simple offer, nothing out of the ordinary, but for some reason I hesitated before answering. Going inside felt different, more personal, but her expression was open, and maybe just a little hopeful, so I nodded. "Sure, coffee sounds great." The house was quiet when we stepped inside, the air cooler than outside and faintly scented with something warm, maybe vanilla or cinnamon. I noticed right away how neat everything was. Polished counters, carefully arranged books on the side table, not a thing out of place. It looked lived in, but just barely, like someone who kept busy with order because it was easier than sitting still. She set a mug down in front of me at the kitchen table, steam curling up from its surface. The mug was warm between my hands, and I found myself just sitting there for a moment, letting the silence settle. "Do you do this kind of work a lot?" she asked, sitting across from me, elbows resting lightly on the table. I nodded. "Here and there. Keeps me busy." She smiled faintly at that, eyes lowering to the coffee in front of her. "Busy's good. Otherwise the days get too quiet." The way she said it wasn't casual. Her voice softened, almost like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. I glanced around the kitchen again, the single chair by the window, the photos on the wall mostly of places, not people. I realized then how empty the house felt despite how beautiful it was. "Your husband's still out of town?" I asked carefully. She nodded, brushing a stray hair from her face. "Another conference. They always seem to come up back to back." She let out a small, self-conscious laugh. "Sometimes I think the fence sees more of me than he does." I smiled at the joke, but there was something in her eyes that made me think she wasn't really joking. It wasn't bitterness, just a quiet weariness that I didn't expect to find there. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound too personal, so I just nodded and sipped my coffee. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It felt like we were both listening to something unspoken, something that made the kitchen feel a little warmer, a little more alive. By early afternoon, the fence was standing straighter than it had in years. I packed my tools back into the box, brushing sawdust from my hands as I stood near the gate. "Well," I said, forcing a light tone, "that should hold for a while. At least until the next storm decides to test my work." Clara smiled faintly, but there was something distant about it, like her thoughts were somewhere else. She nodded, thanked me, and for a moment, it felt like the natural end of the day, that I should just head home, put this behind me. I turned toward the gate, hand on the latch, when I heard her voice, softer than before, almost hesitant. "Don't leave yet." I froze, the words hanging in the still air. Slowly, I turned back. She had stepped closer, her arms folded loosely as though she didn't know what else to do with them. Her eyes met mine, steady but questioning, like she was waiting to see if I'd pull away. Something in my chest shifted. I let go of the latch and took a small step back toward her. "Everything okay?" I asked quietly. She nodded, but didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, her fingertips brushing my forearm, barely there, but enough to send a subtle shiver through me. "Just sit with me for a minute," she said finally, her voice softer now, almost a plea. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because the moment suddenly felt charged with something I couldn't quite name. The yard was quiet except for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. The sky had turned pale gold as the afternoon light shifted, throwing long shadows across the grass. "Sure," I said finally. She led the way to the back porch steps, her hand trailing along the railing as she sat down. I followed, setting my toolbox aside, and lowered myself onto the step beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I could feel the warmth of her shoulder near mine, the soft brush of the breeze carrying the faint scent of her perfume, something warm and sweet, like vanilla and cedar. She drew in a slow breath, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. "I know it probably sounds silly," she said at last, her voice quiet. "But sometimes it just feels good to have someone around. Someone to sit with, even if we don't say anything." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. There was a quiet ache in her words that I felt deep in my chest, like I'd been invited into a part of her life no one else had seen in a long time. The wooden steps creaked softly as I shifted, resting my elbows on my knees. The afternoon had turned quiet, the kind of stillness where even the birds seemed to pause. Clara sat beside me, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere out beyond the fence I'd just repaired. For a long time, we didn't speak. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy but necessary, like it was giving her room to find her words. Finally, she let out a breath and said softly, "I used to love this backyard." I glanced at her. "Used to?" She nodded slowly, her thumb brushing over the edge of her sweater cuff. "When we first moved here, I'd spend hours out here. I planted flowers along that back row, set up a little table for summer dinners." She smiled faintly at the memory, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Lately, I just don't bother. It feels too quiet out here now." I didn't push her, just let the words hang. She glanced at me then, her expression open, almost vulnerable. "I know my husband works hard. I know he loves what he does. But sometimes it feels like I'm just holding down the fort until he decides to come home." Her voice caught slightly on the last word, and she looked down quickly, as though embarrassed by her own honesty. I swallowed, my chest tightening at the sight. "That sounds lonely," I said quietly. Her shoulders sank a little, as if hearing the words spoken aloud allowed her to finally admit it to herself. "It is," she said, almost in a whisper. "Some nights I catch myself talking to the dog just to hear another voice. Something about that image, her in this quiet house, filling the silence with words no one else would hear, hit me harder than I expected." "I don't think that's silly," I said, my voice low. "I think you just want to be heard." Her eyes lifted to mine then, and for a long moment we just looked at each other. The breeze stirred her hair across her cheek, and without thinking, I reached out and gently brushed it back. My fingers barely grazed her temple, but the touch felt strangely electric. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a slow, steady breath, her gaze softening. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For not just fixing the fence and leaving." Her lips curved into the smallest smile, one that carried more warmth than all the ones before it. I didn't know how to answer, so I just nodded, letting my shoulder lean slightly toward hers. The space between us seemed to shrink naturally, until I could feel the heat of her arm through her sweater. The porch stayed quiet after that, like the world had decided to give us this moment uninterrupted. The sun was sliding lower, casting a soft amber glow over the yard. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, catching the light like tiny sparks. Clara shifted slightly, as if debating something with herself, then turned her face toward me. "You probably think I'm being dramatic," she said, her voice low but steady. I shook my head. "I don't think that at all." Her eyes lingered on mine, searching for any trace of judgment, and when she didn't find it, something in her posture seemed to soften. She let out a breath, long and tired, and for the first time all day, she looked less guarded. "I can't remember the last time someone just sat with me like this," she admitted quietly. Her words settled deep in me. Without thinking too much about it, I shifted closer until our knees nearly touched. "Then I'm glad I stayed," I said simply. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It felt warm, safe, like sitting beside a fire on a cool evening. Then, almost imperceptibly, Clara leaned sideways until her shoulder brushed against mine. She hesitated, as though giving me a chance to move away, but I stayed exactly where I was. Slowly, she rested her head against my shoulder. The weight of her was light but grounding, her hair soft against my cheek. I felt her exhale, a quiet sigh that seemed to take some of the day's heaviness with it. My chest tightened, not from discomfort, but from the strange sense of being trusted in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't speak. I didn't dare. I just sat there, listening to the faint rustle of the wind and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the fence. Minutes passed like that. The warmth of the setting sun touched her face, making her skin glow faintly golden. My arm rested carefully against hers, close enough that I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing. When she finally straightened, she did so slowly, like she didn't really want the moment to end. Her smile was small, but this time it felt unguarded, real. "Thank you," she said again, her voice softer now. I met her eyes. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do," she replied, a touch of playfulness in her tone. "Not everyone would have stayed." I could have said a dozen things in that moment, that she deserved to have someone stay, that I didn't want to be anywhere else, but I held my tongue. Some truths felt better left in the quiet between us, at least for now. The sun had dipped low enough that the yard was bathed in soft, golden light. Everything touched with that fleeting glow that makes the world look warmer than it really is. The air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and cut grass. Clara stood first, brushing the back of her jeans as she did. I followed her lead, picking up my toolbox and setting it by the steps. It should have been the natural end to the day, time to say goodbye and head back across the yard, but neither of us moved toward the gate right away. Instead, we lingered there by the porch, both quiet, as if we weren't quite ready to let go of whatever had just passed between us. "Feels different out here now," Clara said softly, almost to herself. I glanced toward the fence I'd just repaired. "Stronger, at least." She smiled at that, but her gaze stayed on me a moment longer than it needed to. "That too," she said. When we finally started walking toward the gate, it was slow, not because the path was long, but because neither of us seemed in a hurry to close the distance. At the gate, she reached out to unlatch it, and as she did, the back of her hand brushed against mine. It was such a small thing, that fleeting contact, but it was enough to send a quiet spark through me. I glanced at her, and for once she didn't look away. "You know," she said softly, "I make a decent cup of coffee in the mornings. You should stop by sometime, when you don't have a hammer in your hand." Her tone was light, almost teasing, but there was a hint of something earnest beneath it. I nodded. "I'd like that." For a moment, we just stood there, the space between us filled with quiet understanding. Then she smiled. Really smiled this time. The kind of smile that made her whole face soften, and I realized how different she looked when she let herself be seen. As I stepped through the gate, she rested her hand briefly on the top rail, watching me go. It wasn't a goodbye exactly, more like an unspoken promise that this wouldn't be the last time we sat on that porch together. I carried that thought with me as I walked back across my own yard, the golden light stretching long behind me. I had come over just to fix a fence, but somehow I had walked into something far more fragile and far more important than loose boards and nails.